Good morning and welcome to Chapter 1, Part 1 with Jay Richards. I'm your host, Meg Foley. I will be moderating this event and will be around at the office hours, morning, noon, and night to be able to answer any questions that you might have. This is day 2 of Code Academy, day 1 of our virtual continuing education. We do have about 450 people attending class today, so I'm really excited that we're able to offer this opportunity to all of our Ohio certified personnel. Um, Today's class is really interesting and also part of the required instruction that you need for your certification renewal. Jay Richards is an assistant architect administrator here at the Board of Building Standards. He has had a long career in architecture before he came to the board. He is deeply involved in code updates and code revisions and is our residential guru, as you'll see in a couple of the other classes he's going to be teaching this week. With that, I'm going to pass you off to Jay Richards.
Thank you, Megan. Welcome and good morning. I will reiterate, welcome to day 2 of the Fall Code Academy, our second virtual Fall Code Academy, or Code Academy. I hope all of you that joined us on day 1 had an enjoyable experience and it worked well. And I too welcome all of those new folks here for your first experience in getting some additional CE credits. Looking out my window, it is wet and rainy here today, but hopefully we can keep it a little bit on the sunny side, at least in this presentation. I am a registered architect, and my primary duties are addressing questions that come into the board related to the Residential Code of Ohio. Chapter 1 is what we're here for today, and CE credits relative to Chapter 1. It's going to be broken down into 2 parts. I have Part 1, Rob Johnson has Part 2, and I have a lot of material to cover today, and I'll be moving quickly to get through it all. And there will be opportunities that you may have a chance to ask a question. If I didn't cover something well enough, you can introduce those questions to the chat box through this presentation. So without further ado, how about we get rolling on the presentation? Meg?
Your presentation is live, Jay.
Thanks, Meg. So, Chapter 1, Part 1. Let me move myself out of the way here. Oh, come on. There we go. So, this is talking about the interlinked processes and how the building code works with other codes, other authorities, other jurisdictions. It talks about roles and responsibilities from owners, from designers, as well as from building enforcement professionals. And it's all about the owner wanting to build and occupy, use a building for their purposes. And we want to make sure it's safe and sanitary. We will be focusing on the Ohio Building Code and the building approval process represented by the blue arrow, and primarily goes from late in the design process through the construction and occupancy. So the Board of Building Standards has responsibilities in code. They have a responsibility statutorily to formulate and adopt the building codes that are enforceable. They are rules related to safe and sanitary conditions, energy conservation, and accessibility. They are charged with developing it into 2 families of codes. One is the Residential Code of Ohio, for which I am primarily responsible for answering questions. The other is for the non-residential building codes, and that would be including the Ohio Building Code, the Ohio Plumbing Code, the Ohio Mechanical Code. Along with that, they have the authority to, the board doesn't have the authority to enforce, but they have written rules about enforcement through certifications of personnel, whom many of you are attending this presentation, and the process that is followed for approvals of buildings for safe sanitary occupancy. And Chapter 1 is all about that process. So let's get going. I want to start off with a little bit of introduction and some key words that we're going to talk about today. First and foremost, Chapter 1 is about administration, which I talked about. We're going to talk about what Chapter 1 serves to do, as well as how does this help. So it serves to organize the process, interrelate with other rules, establish duties and responsibilities, and provide procedures. If you haven't gotten that already, hopefully this kind of cements it in. How do we believe that this helps? Well, it helps to make it easier to navigate, understand the enforcement process, and provide a common arena or common platform for all participants, owners, designers, enforcement officials, to have good, clear expectations of what each party is responsible for in the design and construction and occupancy of a building. We are going to be focusing on the Ohio Building Code, which had an effective date of November 1, 2017, and I will be referencing the Chapter 1 commentary as I go through this by page number, where you can find some additional reference material. If you don't know, Ohio has adopted Chapter 1 as Ohio language. So we have written a commentary specific to Ohio on understanding Chapter 1. And you can find that commentary on the board's website under the non-residential building codes tab. It'll be Chapter 1 commentary. The cover page looks something like this, and I will be referencing it throughout the presentation today. So Chapter 1 is organized into roughly 15 sections, or actually exactly 15 sections. The list is here. They are color-coded into sort of subject matter to help group them visually. The first one is what is and isn't covered by the code. So that's going to be dealing with scope. What is regulated, what isn't regulated, who has jurisdiction in what arenas. The second group is who can do what. So that's dealing with certifications and duties and responsibilities within the enforcement jurisdiction. The next group is about approvals. The law requires that owners get approval for their construction and what the owner must submit in terms of construction documents to get that approval. The next group is all about assuring compliance. It's about taking those submitted documents and making sure that it goes through a process of plan approval, inspections, to get a certificate of occupancy, which is ultimately the owner's goal, and we want to help them get there. So that's about assurance. Now, there's always questions that arise in the design and construction process about, is it code compliant, isn't it code compliant? And there is process in section 109 and 110 about orders and violations and appeals to help resolve those differences. The next section is about certificate of occupancy and certificate of completion. So with an approval, the owner is asking for permission to construct something, alter something, change the use of something. In section 111, certificate of occupancy or completion is about communicating to the owner that they have completed that process and they are able to lawfully occupy their building. The last sections are unique to Ohio, and they are processes about management of the code, talking about industrialized units, how do we approve products and materials, methods of assembly, and then about how the board and the board's committees are made and operate. As I mentioned before, I am dealing with part 1. Rob Johnson will be dealing with part 2. Part 1 are the sections that remain on the screen that I will be dealing with. The other sections Rob will be dealing with in part 2. So it's key in understanding code that we have some definitions that help us clearly understand what terms mean. There are going to be some specific meanings relative to the code, and there's going to be general usage meanings. So on the specific meanings, you're going to find those in Chapter 2 of the Ohio Building Code. All of the defined terms are going to be in Chapter 2. We have pulled out some of those in the commentary, and we are going to be talking about those here in a little bit. The general usage, if you have a question about something and it's not defined in Chapter 2, then a commonly published dictionary is a good source to find out how a term is defined and how it would be understood within the meaning of the code. As I mentioned before, we're going to be looking at some definitions that were pulled out in the commentary. We're going to look at 5 of those definitions, and actually I'm going to sneak a 6th one in, of the 15 that have been pulled out in the commentary. They are all important, and the ones that I'm not going to talk about actually deal with some exempt buildings and systems, industrialized units, and some other items. Some of those things will be discussed in other sessions throughout Code Academy. So let's get rolling on some definitions. This is the definition of a building official as it appears in the code. The building official is the authority having jurisdiction, or the AHJ sometimes referred to, and their job is to administer and enforce the rules of the board, the building codes. Some of you attending today are probably getting your building official's certificate or in that process. So who can be a building official and what can they enforce? This is all going to be determined in the definition of a building official, or it's going to be included in that definition anyway. Who can be a building official? So there's actually 3 different types of persons identified here. One is the superintendent for the Division of Industrial Compliance. They have the authority to enforce the rules of the board. The next is a designated authority charged with the administration and enforcement of the code and is approved by the board. So that would be a certified building official. That is going to be a lot of who would be attending Code Academy in terms of the building official. The last one is a health commissioner in a health district. They have been identified as being able to enforce the rules of the board, particularly when it comes to health. So within this definition, I've said it already, they're there to enforce this code. They're there to administer and enforce this code. And since this is a definition in the Ohio Building Code, it is referencing the Ohio Building Code. Similar statements are in the Residential Code of Ohio for residential code. So who can be a building official? We've already talked about a superintendent of industrial compliance, a certified individual for a certified building department approved by the Board of Building Standards, the health commissioner of a health district. And what can they enforce? Obviously, the rules of the board or the building codes. So building service equipment is another interesting definition in my mind. It is, there's the definition as it appears. It is going to be those systems that are integrated into the building that provide heating, air conditioning, ventilation, fire protection, lighting, electricity, sanitation, water, heating, cooking, medical gas, medical vacuum, and clothes drying as a list of things. So that's the type of things that are building service equipment. Building service equipment is regulated. There's also in this definition sort of where it starts from and where it continues to. As we all think about building service, we know that power is coming from a utility company, gas may be coming from another utility company. Those are all used within the building, to support and provide power to that service equipment. And in this definition, it talks about where the building code has regulation. It begins from the storage source or the utility service point of delivery and extends through the point of use. So that is where the building service equipment is. It also helps to define this by saying it does not include process equipment, which process equipment is another defined term, but we're not going to necessarily talk about it. It is related. So once again, building service equipment is integrated parts of the building. It supports the safe and sanitary operation of the building, and it does have limits. So it comes from the point of service or point of delivery. It includes any storage mediums, and it excludes process equipment. So there are some related definitions out there that you can go check out to help understand this. Building service piping, as well as process equipment and piping, are out there. They'll become important when it comes to authority to regulate specific things. The next definition we're going to talk about is fire prevention. There's oftentimes some confusion about fire prevention and fire protection. This is the definition of fire prevention. And prevention or protection, is there a difference? Absolutely, there's a difference. Fire prevention is a preventative measure. Fire protection is talking about an integrated system in a building. Sound familiar? It is an integrated system. So fire protection is also building service equipment. Fire prevention is not building service equipment. So fire prevention is going to be talking about the safe conduct and operation of hazardous processes, the safe storage of combustible and flammable materials, the performance of fire and other drills, the maintenance of fire protection, detection and extinguishing equipment, and good housekeeping. So most of fire prevention is about what the owner is doing as they occupy the building to help keep all of those fire protection systems in good working order and keep their building and building occupants safe in terms of the operation of the activities that go on in that building. Fire protection is about approving those devices that detect a fire, activate an alarm, extinguish or control fire, control or manage smoke and the products of fire. So this is where the building official, because it has approval, is required to look at all those things and make sure that they are code compliant, that they are going to exist in a building, and then the owner is going to have to maintain those things under their fire prevention. So fire prevention is, once again, going to be the long-term observation. It is going to involve fire prevention inspections, is going to assure operation relative to fire protection, it's going to maintain things. It is addressed in the Ohio law by the use and enforcement of the Ohio Fire Code. One of the reasons that I've highlighted these things in red is because the Ohio Fire Code gives you fire prevention rules that the owner must comply with, and it is through the local fire prevention inspectors that the Ohio Fire Code gets enforced on the fire prevention. Fire protection requires building department approval. The building official has to approve these things, whether it's new, an addition to, an alteration of, or repair to any of that fire protection systems. The building official has approval. They also have approval if an owner wants to remove or abrogate one of the fire protection systems. The fire official for the jurisdiction also has some responsibility in removal and abrogation of a fire protection system. So fire protection systems is a broad term. It is composed of a combination of different things. automatic sprinkler systems, fire alarm systems, devices that may be individually mounted like fire extinguishers. Those are all going to be part of fire protection systems. Most of that stuff is identified in Chapter 9. Some of the things may reference provisions in the Ohio Fire Code for them to be approved as part of the fire protection system of the building. So you do need to have some knowledge of the Ohio Fire Code as a plans examiner, for instance, a designer, or the building official when it comes to designing appropriate fire protection systems. Maintenance of those fire protection systems is fire prevention. Minor repair. This is the definition as it shows up. Minor repair, almost every contractor that I talk to on a daily basis would really love everything to be a minor repair, even the construction of a new house if they could figure out how to do it. This definition talks about what a minor repair is, as well as what a minor repair is not. So the is pretty straightforward. It's the reconstruction or renewal of any part of the existing building for its purposes of its maintenance when the work has limited impact on access, safety, and health. That's what minor repair is. The rest of it is about what minor repair is not. It does not include those things, both structural things in the first part of the paragraph and building equipment systems in the second part. So what is minor repair? It is work to construct or renew for the purposes of maintenance, and it is limited, or it has minor impact on the access, safety, and health of the building. It should comply with existing or previous approvals. So essentially what they're doing is the owner is looking at what already exists and they're restoring or repairing that to bring it back to what was previously approved and was damaged or got worn out. So you have some evidence of what was previously approved. And in 102.10.2, minor repair is exempt from approval. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that when we talk about 102.10, but one of the reasons why a lot of contractors I talk to would love for minor repair to be exempt from approval because of its exemption. So it is not the removal of walls, the modification of load-bearing support, the modification of accessibility, the modification to a means of egress, the modification of building service piping, to electrical wiring, to building service equipment, work affecting public health or general safety. So if the work that the owner is proposing does any of these things, it can no longer be considered minor repair. It may still be repair, but repair is work that needs to get submitted for approval and go through the process of getting that approval from the authority having jurisdiction. Serious hazard, the last definition that we're going to talk about. It is an important one. It is primarily going to be important when it comes to existing buildings. And there's going to be a lot more discussion about serious hazard in the various existing building sessions that we have dealing with either Chapter 34 later today or Section 113 of the Residential Code, which is an optional class tomorrow. That's the definition. It too is going to talk about what is, and what we are going to talk about as well is what serious hazard is not. So what is it? It's determined by whom and what action is required. So in yellow, pretty clearly, a serious hazard is a hazard. What makes it serious is that is of considerable consequence or certain or probable consequence. And those are key points in determining whether a hazard is a serious hazard. How you understand considerable consequence, certain or probable consequence. It is a hazard that is going to affect safety or health, because that's what the building codes are have the authority to regulate. They have the authority to regulate elements of safety, elements of health in a building. Generally, because a building doesn't have enough insulation, it may not be compliant with energy conservation, not going to constitute a serious hazard. Also in the definition, we see that it is established through experience, can be determined to be, or is obviously a hazard. Now, those are all terms that require a subjective understanding of what the condition is. And under the rules of the board, what you will find out when it comes to making these determinations of what the condition is, it's going to be the responsibility of the building official to either establish through their experience or determine that the hazard, or they can obviously see that the hazard is a serious hazard. So it is of considerable consequence to health or safety. It is established through experience, determined to be or obviously a hazard, and it is judged by the building official and only the building official. The inspectors are the eyes for the building official out there. They can make they can make comment to the building official, but the building official is the one that determines that it is or is not a serious hazard. And the rules say that if it is a serious hazard, action is required and the building official must take action. So typically, and we'll talk about some of those actions a little bit later. Two things about what it is not, and this goes up into sort of that considerable consequence or probable, that it's not about, or making that determination on the behalf of the building official is not about whether it's what they believe or what they prefer, or even if it's possible. The understanding of considerable is that it is imminent, it will endanger life and safety. The litmus test I oftentimes refer to is, if you observe a condition and you think it is a serious hazard, you better be thinking about getting people out of that building, out of that area, away from that, so that nobody gets hurt as a result of that condition. Because in the next moments, hours, maybe days, something bad is going to happen, and that condition will result in injury or loss of life. It's not about possibly someday it might happen, it could happen. I can dream of an event where this is dangerous. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about a serious hazard. And you'll have more discussions about serious hazard, I'm sure, when we talk about existing buildings, chapter 34.
Okay, we have several questions.
Okay.
Okay, leaving aside 101.1 exception 6, because that's something for a deeper discussion in a later moment.
Yeah.
OBC 102.9, discussion of the scope of provision in context of fire systems. Also, building service equipment definition. Is the below slab piping service as drains for brewery equipment in a brewery facility process piping or building services piping?
So the determine on the second one, on the brewery side of things, it'll be important to understand what process equipment is and process piping is. If the equipment is used in the process of making their product, it takes that energy that comes in through building service equipment or building service piping, and generally it'll go through some kind of control point and then into process equipment or process piping. That's where the authority of the Ohio Building Code stops, is at that point of it. We would consider that connection point as the point of use. So, and whether it's underground or above ground, in my mind, is not the question. I think it's where is it relative to building service piping versus process piping. On that note, I can say that we are actually working on a presentation that should be out in December dealing with breweries, wineries, and distilleries, which will go into more detail about that subject and enforcement for those things. And I think if that caller had wanted to have some more discussion about it, we certainly would be open to answering more questions specific to their circumstance.
I have other questions.
Yeah.
If a building has an elective automatic suppression system not required by code and undergoes a change of ownership and use that does not require automatic suppression, may the new owner remove the system? And then a question about minor repair definition is that, does that include repair for fire damage?
Okay. We will talk a little bit about 1029 about non-required work in a little bit as we go into the. We'll go section by section, and so if you have a question about something in another part like 101 or 102 or 10 for me 105, 6, 7, 8, 9. Let's see if we can't try and address those. I will say this about the so we'll address some of the non-required work at 102.9. When it comes to the question about a change of owner, one of the question had two sort of triggers in it. One is a change of ownership, and the other is a change of use. Change of ownership does not affect the building code, or is not affected by the building code. The Ohio Building Code in the short term doesn't really, or short answer, doesn't really care who owns the building. The building code is concerned about how the building is used. So the trigger for the building code would be the change of use that the owner is talking about. And to change the use requires approval from the building department. And that is all going to be covered in Chapter 34 on existing buildings. Then about the fire damage, essentially there are some provisions in the code where obviously fire damage is not likely going to be minor repair. It could be repair. It could be restoration. Those things would still have to go through the building department for approval, and at the end of the day, there would have to be some understanding about whether they are actually making an alteration to, which would trigger compliance with requirements for new construction, or whether they're restoring the damage to the pre-damaged state, which is under its existing approval, and there would be some judgment on the part of the building official as to whether what the owner is proposing is restoration or alteration.
Thank you.
Can I move? All right.
Move on.
So we're going to move into section 101. There we go. So section 101 is the very general section. It's the introduction to the scope. We're going to talk about the title of of the code. We're going to talk about the purpose of the code. So we are dealing with the Ohio Building Code, or the OBC. It is based on the International Building Code, or IBC, which is developed by the International Code Council. It is based on the first printing, and it includes as that starting point chapters 2 through 35. As you recall back at the beginning, note that chapter 1 is not in here. We do not use chapter 1 of the IBC. We use our own Ohioized chapter 1, and so we put on these classes to understand what chapter 1 is. A lot of the concepts are the same, but it is unique to Ohio. So if you are wanting to learn, wanting to use, wanting to know chapter 1, sort of the administration and the processes of code enforcement and roles and responsibilities, you should be looking at Ohio Building Code chapter 1. The next sections are going to be talking about the purpose. So it'll be a scope about what is regulated, the intent, how it interrelates with other rules, standards, laws, and those things will come through by reference. I also mentioned that we have 2 families of codes. There is the Residential Code of Ohio, which deals with buildings that are exclusively 1, 2, and 3 family dwellings. And it is a statewide residential code. There is a definition of residential buildings, which also excludes industrialized units. It excludes manufactured housing, and it excludes basically vehicles, those things regulated by the Ohio Department of Transportation that may have features of dwellings, but are not enforced under the residential code. So, scope of the code, 101.2. This talks about what the Ohio Building Code has enforcement over, and you'll notice down at the bottom that there are some exceptions. So the types of buildings that are within the scope of the codes, it also addresses dwellings and accessory structures that are regulated under the Ohio Building Code, and talks about the land on which the building is located. A lot of you may be thinking, what, land? Yeah. Isn't land part of zoning? Yes, land is part of zoning in terms of how the land is used, but there are, by law, some parts that we regulate out of the OBC. So to start with, the Ohio Building Code, the provisions of the Ohio Building Code shall apply to construction, alteration, movement, enlargement, replacement, repair, equipment, occupancy, location, maintenance, removal, demolition of building structures and any appurtenances connected thereto. So it pretty broad in terms of the activity that an owner wants to do with a building, a particular building. It goes on to talk about that the code also applies to detached 1, 2, and 3 family dwellings and their accessory structures, but it limits the application of the Ohio Building Code to the extent indicated in section 310 of this code. So chapter 3 is about group classification and occupancy. It's about how that dwelling is used. So it may look like a 1, 2, or 3 family dwelling, but it's being used in a more commercial way. And so section 310 brings it into the OBC. There is another class on that tomorrow. If anybody is interested, it's one of the optional classes about multiple occupancies. The last thing that's in the middle of this scope is that plans and specifications basically shall be approved and inspection approval given, and that will indicate that the building complies. It's all written in the negative, I see that, but basically it's an owner has to get a building approved and the inspections have to be satisfactory, and that will indicate that the building complies with the law, 3781, or the statutes, 3781, 3791 from revised code, and any rules adopted by the board. So that's essentially the scope. So there's all different kinds of things that are building from the various types of construction, new addition, alteration, and repair. The OBC is going to regulate those things. The occupancy of the building is going to impact the regulation of that building. If you want to make it bigger, if you want to change its location, if you, the maintenance to some degree it may trigger the code if the scope of that maintenance is broad enough that it gets to replacements and removals, demolitions. The building code regulates all that stuff. Again, dwellings and accessory structures, go look at 310 and see when the OBC is triggered. And this gets back to the land thing, that residential code, or not residential code, revised code section 378110 talks about the Ohio building code regulates the buildings and the land incidental thereto. So there's a little bit of outside the building that is regulated. It's primarily dealing with protections of foundations and the connections of building drain systems to sewer systems. Sewer systems are outside of the authority of the Ohio Building Code, but the drain is part of the Ohio Building Code. And we want to protect our foundations by moving that water away. So I talked about those exceptions. Work that's outside the scope of the building code starts with those exceptions. There are 23 specific items under the exceptions. Generally, they are going to be structures regulated by other entities for other specific purposes, or they're not a building or part thereof. A couple of the most notable ones are manufactured housing is exempt from regulation under the residential code. However, if the owner does a change of occupancy in a manufactured house and they turn it into a beauty salon or a barber shop or something like that, now the change of occupancy brings that structure into enforcement under the Ohio Building Code. Land use, as I mentioned before, typically governed by zoning codes. How is the land used? Insurance claims, property sales, and ownership are all outside the scope of the code. Many of my questions deal with who is paying for work through an insurance claim and what is that scope of work that is required. The building codes are not really written about who pays. They're written about what is safe and sanitary. Again, property sales, ownership, the building can change owners and it does not trigger the building code. A change of use triggers the building code and compliance, but not ownership. Contracts and contractors, that's in there because the building code does not address who performs the work. The work must be safe, must be sanitary. It addresses energy conservation, and in the commercial side, it addresses accessibility. But who does it is not an issue for the scope of the OBC. Now, on commercial work, there are agencies that do have regulation over some contracts and contractors about who performs the work. To oftentimes refer to OCILB, Construction Industry Licensing Board, for some trades. Exceeding minimum requirements in the code, an owner is permitted to exceed the minimum requirements. If they do exceed, they must comply with any provisions relative to that system that are applicable to that construction to the extent of that construction. And I believe we'll talk about that some more at 102.9.
Jay, we have a quick question before you move on.
Sure.
And the question is, what happens if a building is zoned agricultural, but the use of the building is clearly not agricultural purposes.
Okay, so agricultural use and what we oftentimes refer to as agricultural exemption is one of those 23 that are exempted in there. The statutes 3781.06 and 3781.061 provide two means by which a building can get agricultural exemption. Under 3781.06, there is an exception reference which gives authority to the building official in the building department to exempt the structure, and where is it? It's exemption number 3, to exempt the structure for as incidental to the use of agricultural purposes, and it describes that stuff in there. 3781.061 gives the authority to the zoning inspector to issue a certificate out of the zoning rules to exempt a specific building. The building official can either make the determination themselves through 3781.06 and exempt that building, or they can accept the certificate from a zoning official that has exempted that building for agricultural purposes as evidence of exception from complying with the Ohio Building Code. Now, there has to be an understanding of what agricultural purposes is. There are several definitions throughout the statutes that talk about what agricultural purposes are, and it's about raising crops, it's about animal husbandry, it's about processing some of those crops, processing some of that what you grow and raise as agricultural purposes. And then you get into, in the definition on the OBC, about the business of retail trade, that you remain agriculturally exempt as long, and if you're selling things, it's like as soon as you start to sell them, you are no longer producing them, you're moving into a mercantile kind of environment, that when you start to sell them, that may trigger a change of occupancy. And for the purposes of enforcing the building code, they talk about what that level is. If everything you sell is from products that you grew, raised, and processed on your farm in a typical agricultural season, it is still agriculturally exempt, even though you are selling that. If you sell other things in that marketplace, you can sell up to, but not past, 50% of your income from that retail can come from things other than what you grew or raised in a typical year on your property. As soon as you cross that 50% line by bringing in other products that you are selling, you are now a change of occupancy, according to exception number 3. Again, I would be happy to discuss in greater detail with anybody about what that is if they want to send me a note or something like that. Good to go? Good to go. So we're going to talk a little bit about the intent of the code, the purpose of the OBC, what it's related to, and the kinds of considerations. This is about what the board looks at, is charged with, and what's going through the board's mind as they write these rules. They also are talking about enforcement of the OBC and what must happen in the enforcement. So this is direction and guidance to those people that are enforcing the OBC. This gives some insight to owners and designers about what the words mean and what they can expect from enforcement authority. So when we talk about the purpose of the code, it's about creating uniform minimum requirements in the OBC. And those requirements are to relate to energy conservation, safety, sanitation. Statutes also have included accessibility, but there's a fine balance there between complying with the Ohio Building Code and complying with federal statutes, which that's going to be the accessibility issue. Now, as we look at those things, all of that stuff, those rules that are generated to make uniform minimum requirements dealing with energy, safety, and sanitation, the board has been thinking as has consideration for those requirements are applicable to the use intended. What's good for a hotel may not be good for a factory, may not be good for a prison or jail or correctional facility, may not be good for a theater. So they all have different risks. So we have to be thinking about what the intended use is, and those requirements are applicable. And the rules must also permit to the fullest extent feasible the use of materials, techniques, devices, and improvements. We understand, or the board understands, that changes happen, improvements are made, new materials come to market, new ways of building things are out there and applicable. One of the things that we're dealing with currently, that's probably one of the bigger changes that I've seen, is the use of wood in tall buildings these days. There is a whole set of requirements that are being brought into the International Model Code family that deals with the use of wood in tall buildings. All of that is important, but we still can't affect or negatively impact the minimum requirements. And finally, cost is always an important consideration in any kind of development, and the standardization is part of what the board thinks about when they're thinking about cost, and it's about encouraging standardization, that these rules should be made to get more people understanding how something is done in a common way. So then the last part is guidance in the rules to the enforcement authorities, that, okay, the board has had this intent about the rules of the board. Now that it goes out into the field, the owners designed this thing, this building. He needs to get approval so that he can start his construction. He has to take it to enforcement authority, and their guidance and direction is that the rules of the board shall be liberally construed to promote its purpose. Seems kind of broad. Doesn't mean that they can do anything they want. Doesn't mean they can interpret it any way they want. It still has to meet the intent, meet the minimum requirements, be safe, sanitary, conserve energy, all of those things. But the purpose is going to be that when the building official finds that the proposed design is a reasonable interpretation of the provisions of the code, it shall be approved. So if you are a building official, you're going to be the one that interprets what the rules say are the minimum requirements. And if that owner's proposed design meets those requirements in a reasonable fashion, then you must approve that design. You may not agree with it, but if it's a reasonable interpretation, you must approve it. So just to reiterate, the purpose of the OBC is to establish uniform minimum requirements, and minimum requirements can be exceeded. They're going to be related to safety, sanitation, and energy conservation for the intended use, and that there's going to be consideration for performance of those materials, devices, products. We want to not limit, so we want to permit the stuff that's coming out new. We want to help reduce cost without affecting health, safety, and security of the occupants. We want to promote standardization in terms of practices, methods, materials, and devices. And the provisions should be liberally construed, not thrown out the window, not, you know, up to any whim, but you have to kind of meet these intents, and if there is a reasonable application, it'll get approved. So at 1014, we talk about referenced codes, and that we list a number of them at 101.4.1 to 101.4.7, and those reference codes should be considered part of the Ohio Building Code to the prescribed extent. So those reference, again, to the prescribed extent. Other rules, other codes that the Board of Building Standards writes are the Ohio Mechanical Code, Ohio Plumbing Code, the Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code, and the Ohio Elevator Code. Also under the Department of Commerce is the State Fire Marshal's Office, and they have the authority to write the Ohio Fire Code. Now that's going to deal with fire prevention. We reference that code because throughout the building code, we oftentimes, particularly in chapters 9, we reference the Ohio Fire Code, and some of the requirements can be found over there. This particular form, I just captured the top of it. As you will recall, we had the Ohio Elevator Code is actually one of the codes that the board writes. It is enforced, at least for the public elevators, it is enforced by the Division of Elevators here in the Division of Industrial Compliance. And one of the things that we found over time was that there is a butting up or a juxtaposition of where the elevator division has enforcement authority and the building department has enforcement authority, and it's been somewhat unclear as to where that is. So this matrix was made in conjunction with Division of Elevators, and it talks about what all those things are. Some of the confusion has come because elevator technology has developed to a point where the elevator that you see today is not the same as the elevator that you saw even 10 years ago. Machine rooms are different, and control spaces are different. Sometimes they're in the jam of the elevator, and there's requirements written for what has to happen with the control space, and that's now the lobby in front of the elevator. So this matrix is created. It is for coordination of enforcement between those two entities that have enforcement authority over something that is within the same building. Our Division of Elevators is more than welcome and welcomes the opportunity to work with any building departments, any building officials that want some more clarity about this and what they should be looking at. I'm going to move on to section 102. This is going to be application and jurisdictional authority. So back to our little chart here, we have this whole interlinked process. And this is going to be about jurisdictional authority. So we're going to be looking at, as you see a little guy grow there, that's the building department. That represents enforcement of building code rules. The guy below him, he's getting a little bigger. That's the state fire marshal's office. That's fire officials and enforcement of fire prevention rules. Then up towards the top of the page, The building owner is also going to be having to think about any local jurisdiction ordinances that they may have to comply with, zoning being one of them. The other thing up there is going to be in reference to licensing agencies. So if you have a food service operation, or you have a child care operation, or you have a hospital, you may have some responsibilities to get a license to operate your business, and they may have some rules that may need to get integrated into your building design. So we recognize that all of these different agencies may have rules that may impact an owner's design of their building to achieve what they want to do. So here's where we're going to talk about some of those interrelated processes. All right. So in general, one of the first things that we have to deal with is differences or discrepancies in code. So if we have different sections of the code, of this code, and they happen, that specify different materials, methods, or construction, the most restrictive shall govern. We also clarify that if there's a conflict between a general requirement and a specific requirement, the specific requirement shall be applicable. We're going to run through a couple of quick examples here. One is where we're talking about a most restrictive requirement, so the first part of that. One of the things you'll see is that table 506.2 specifies that an H3 occupancy allows areas from 5,000 square feet to unlimited square footage, depending on the type of construction. You'll also see that OBC section 415.10.5.1 specifies that H3 consumer fireworks facilities cannot exceed 5,000 square feet. So here we have two requirements. One says an H3, any H3 can be unlimited depending on its type of construction. If it's specifically a consumer fireworks facility, it can't exceed 5,000, so more restrictive. Therefore, an H3 occupancy consumer fireworks is limited to 5,000 square feet for all types of construction. That would be an example of how 102.1 is applied. We also want to look at where a specific requirement governs, and I'm going to have a couple of examples here. This one for me is a little bit of a challenge because a lot of the code is built on moving from a general concept to specific concepts. So a lot of the code requirements follow this line of thinking, and you just drill down to where the most specific requirement exists in my mind. So the building code table 307.1 parenthesis 1, this is going to deal with hazardous materials. It points out that you're permitted to have 150 pounds of liquefied flammable gas per control area that can be stored or used in a closed system without the building being classified as a group H high hazard occupancy. But you see a little bit later in that section that any hazard, 307.1.2 says that any hazardous material in any amount must conform to the requirements in section 414 and the Ohio Fire Code. Here's one of those references going over to the Ohio Fire Code. So you have to also be aware of what requirements are in the Fire Code for some of these hazards based on that type of hazardous material. So when you go to table 414.2.2, you'll see that it reduces the quantity per control area and the number of control areas allowed based on the story above or below grade plane on which the hazardous material is stored or used. So just because table 307.1 parentheses 1 says you can have 150 pounds of liquefied flammable gas, 414.2.2 reduces that quantity if that gas is used or stored, say, at the third level above grade plane. Therefore, 414.2.2 may drive the occupancy classification of the building in lieu of table 307.1 parentheses 1. Another example, this one's going to deal a little bit with fire protection systems. 304 classifies an ambulatory care facility as a group B occupancy. 903.2 does not, in general, require automatic fire sprinkler systems in Group B occupancies. 903.2.2 requires an automatic sprinkler system throughout the entire floor containing an ambulatory care facility where either of two conditions exist. So there's two conditions out there that you have to meet. Not just that it's an ambulatory care facility, but there's also two conditions dealing with that ambulatory care facility. And it's about how many people you're dealing with and what their level of self-preservation is. Now, 903.2.2 also requires that an automatic fire sprinkler system is throughout the entire floor where care is provided and all intervening floors where the care facility is on a level other than the level of exit discharge. And when I'm talking about the care facility here, it's specifically to an ambulatory care facility, which is a defined type of care facility. So there's a couple requirements here that are going to require automatic sprinkler systems in a Group B occupancy building where you may not think or expect to find an automatic sprinkler system. So it is a more specific requirement based on how the building is used. It still is a Group B building, but it has an ambulatory care facility in it. So other laws, this is going to talk about how the OBC works with other state and federal laws, so statutes. It's also going to talk about municipal corporations that have authority to modify and add to building codes. So for state and federal, the OBC is basically considered not shall not be deemed to nullify any provisions of state or federal. So we can't be in conflict with state and federal law. The state or other state or federal laws can't say you can do this and we say you can't, and vice versa. Municipal corporations, it talks about it in the next sentence, that they may make further and additional regulations, provided they're not in conflict with 3781 and 3791 of the Revised Code, which that's where the legislature gave the Board of Building Standards the authority to write the rules, and any rules made by the board relative to that authority. So not in conflict. It's a lot about not being in conflict. 1023 talks about some other rules. Now these are going to be rules, so other agencies out there that write rules. Department of Health writes rules, State Fire Marshal writes rules, we write rules, Industrial Compliance writes rules. What if an owner needs a license to operate? This is one of the things where we're going to address that in 1023. So the rules of the board will supersede and govern any order, standard, or rule by those listed agencies. It also goes on to say that if an owner is required to meet some requirements through licensing, that the owner and the designer for that owner should investigate those licensing requirements and ensure that they are incorporated into the drawings that are provided to the building department for approval, for that plan approval. So it puts requirements on the owner to investigate what those licensing requirements are and get them in the documents for approvals, so that when it comes time for that licensing agency to issue their license as approval to conduct that business in that building, they have all of those features built in that license requires. Again, this kind of summarizes that the board's rules supersede and govern orders, standards, and rules from the State Fire Marshal, Industrial Compliance, Department of Health, except there is one exception, that if it is dealing with fireworks out of Chapter 3743, which is regulated by the State Fire Marshal's office, our rules, the rules of the board, do not supersede or govern those. Again, agency requirements. There may be some requirements that an owner needs to comply with to get that license, and they must include those licensing requirements in the submitted documents. So reference codes and standards. This is going to be things that the building code references from within the building code to documents outside the building code. Which one must be used? Many times these things are just like the building code. They get written and adopted in the year 1900, and by the year 2020, they have had to go through several changes, several iterations, so there's different editions. And this section talks about which edition you're supposed to use. Are there limits? Yes, there are limits, and we'll talk about those a little bit. What if there is a conflict between the code and the reference standard? And that gets addressed in this section as well. So when you're looking at a reference standard that's being made, whether it's to a federal statutory provision, whether it's to industry consensus standard or a technical publication, you must use the edition that is listed in Chapter 35, which is the list of reference standards in the Ohio Building Code, with the specific date and title and the promulgating agency for that provision standard publication. The plumbing code and the mechanical code have similar reference standard chapters. They're chapter 15 in each one of those sets. Also, the codes and standards referenced shall be considered part of the requirements of this code to the prescribed extent. And that would be the building code itself may have an extent, may have limits in terms of how it applies, because the standard may go past what the building code has authority to govern, as well as the reference standard itself may have specific provisions as to what they're looking at and how it applies. And then the last part is if there are differences, the provisions of these codes shall apply. So the rules of the board. We go back to our list, which one, again, it's the reference is made out of the rules of the board. It has to go to the chapter of reference standards. It has to be the date, title, and the promulgating agency listed in those chapters. There are limits. It may come from the code. It may come from the standard. And yes, you do use the rule of the board if there's a conflict between the building code and the reference standard. So existing facilities, 1027. This is one of my go-to sections. It's kind of where I start a lot of my answers to anybody who has a question about making some kind of change to their existing building. Why 1027? Well, in brief, existing buildings make up a huge part of the stock, a much greater percentage than new construction. There's a concept out there that buildings have rights, so an existing building has a right to continue to exist, and that it serves as guidance for enforcement. I think those are the primary things for 1027. One of the big questions comes out is, when is a building considered an existing building? And what if a building doesn't have a certificate of occupancy? Those things are all addressed in here. It's a good starting point to address those things. So you'll see that the provisions of Chapter 34 shall control any work on an existing building. Notice that new construction is not listed there. It is alteration, repair, addition, maintenance, and change of occupancy. You've got to go to Chapter 34, and that will start telling you, breaking down what parts of that construction have to comply with the requirements for new construction. So the occupancy of the structure currently existing shall be permitted to continue without change. That is, the building has rights. It can continue without change, provided there's no orders of the building official pending, so no outstanding orders, no evidence of fraud, and no serious safety or sanitation hazard. So here's where we get into one of those defined terms about serious hazard. So if that building is existing and people are in it, they're occupying it, they're using it, and there's no orders from the building department, there's no serious safety hazards, they can continue using that building, and they are not required by the building code to make any changes until they choose to make changes. If they want to alter it or repair it or add to it or change the occupancy within it, then they go up to Chapter 34. So if a building doesn't have a certificate of occupancy, and the owner for some reason needs a certificate of occupancy, they're trying to get some insurance coverage, or they're trying to get a license and they need a certificate of occupancy to do those things, they can request a process by the building department and get a certificate of occupancy for an existing building. And there's a process for that. And then it relies on the previous paragraph where if it currently exists and there's no orders and no serious hazards, that it can continue to exist. Then the last part of that, it really does kind of hammer down what an existing building is, or one of the premises is that it is a building that has gone through the approval process and it was approved prior to the effective date of this code, our existing building. So, we went through a code change in November 1 of 2017. If it was a building that wasn't constructed yet, but was approved under the 2011 Ohio Building Code, for the purposes of enforcement of the 2017, it's considered an existing building. It is allowed to be built under that 2011 code and occupied as appropriate, even though it may not comply with the 2017 building code. In summary, buildings have rights. It is assumed to comply with the code enforced at the time, provided there's no outstanding orders, no evidence of fraud, and no serious safety hazard. That phrase comes up more and more as you go and evaluate existing buildings. Control of enforcement of the OBC for existing buildings goes out to Chapter 34, and there'll be a lot more discussion about that in later seminar presentations. Existing buildings, the most obvious is that it has a certificate of occupancy, or possibly per 102.7, it is constructed in accordance with plans approved prior to this effective date, so it may not have a certificate of occupancy, or possibly it was constructed a long time ago, doesn't have a certificate of occupancy, it got lost. That the occupancy on the date of adoption of this code, so November 1, 2017, it can continue to be used unchanged, provided, back up to the top, the building has rights, there's no orders, there's no evidence of fraud, and there's no serious safety hazards. A certificate of occupancy can be issued to an existing building, but it must be requested, and the building department has to do an investigation and an inspection. There has to be evidence that the use is as requested, and there's, again, no orders and no serious hazards. Now that certificate of occupancy is issued, and it must be titled a certificate of occupancy for an existing building, and on the C of O, it'll have information relative to any limitations relative to that approval. So non-required work, 102.9, we talked about, there were some questions about this earlier. So here, that any component, any part of the building that's not required by the code is permitted to be installed either partially or completely, provided that is constructed and installed in accordance with the requirements in this code to the extent of the installation. So probably one of the biggest ones is fire suppression systems. You can, if your B occupancy doesn't require suppression systems, you can install fire suppression systems for part of the building or the whole building. But if it is for part of the building, that part that you would install it for, it has to be installed in accordance with the requirements to the extent of that installation. Now, if you wanted credit on your height and area for sprinkled throughout and you only sprinkle 2 floors, you can't get that. But if you had perhaps a desire to have that ambulatory care facility on the 2nd floor and you sprinkled 2 floors, you'd be already set up to put an ambulatory care facility on floor 1 or floor 2. Might be some reasons why someone might want to do that. 102.10, work exempt from approval. A couple of key points here. This is about a list of things that plan approval is not required for that list of work. However, the work still has to comply with the applicable provisions of the rule of the board. The list of items is broken down into major categories, and there's those number of items under each major category. One of the examples that we like to use is, like, we picked the electrical one, and they talk about how plan approval is not required for the installation of low voltage wiring. Doesn't mean that you can take that low voltage wiring then and run non-plenum rated wire through a ceiling plenum that requires rated wire in the plenum. You can't take that wire and run it through a fire rated assembly without also providing for the protections of that penetration in that fire rated assembly. So you have to comply with the rules relative to it, but you may not have to get approval for running those control wires. Also in 102.10, we do talk about emergency repairs at 10.1, which basically says if the owner has a problem, he needs to get it fixed because water is coming in through the damaged roof. He can make those corrections, but if he needs to get approval for that work, he has grace to submit for plan approval within 24 hours following that work. Also in 102.10 is the section 102.10.2, which deals with minor repair, and it says that minor repair is exempt from approval. However, it still has to comply with whatever that work is, still has to comply with the applicable provisions of the rules of the board. Now, minor repairs, it may be complying with a previous approval, and not the current rules in the 2017. So building departments will have jurisdictional limitations, and 102.11 talks about that. That's the list of other authorities that work in the jurisdiction, oftentimes to which the building department's jurisdiction will bump up against, and it is expressed here. So fire is going to deal with fire prevention, health is going to deal with sanitary conditions, sewage and draining systems are going to be dealing with building, sewers and laterals, power generation, and then so the power plants have some autonomy to do their own regulation of some of their stuff, particularly in their generation sites. And then state projects basically goes to the state of Ohio's building department for any buildings constructed on state-owned property or in state-owned buildings. All right, so I'm going to go back to my interlinked process. We now have all this 102. We have the interlinked processes. Blank sheet though. So an owner, this purple line represents the timeline that an owner has when he's got this idea. He wants to build a building and occupy it for his business, his commerce. And what does he need to think about? It's kind of a blank slate right now for a new building. So he's got this idea, he's going to hire a designer, he gets that design down. Now what does he have to do? The law says he needs to get approvals both to start construction and to occupy that building. So to get those approvals, he needs to be looking at the building departments and the rules of the board and enforcement of building codes. He needs to be considering the state fire marshal's rules and what they may have for fire prevention. He must think about local ordinances and what rules they may have, zoning requirements, most notably maybe some architectural review requirements if the jurisdiction wants the building to look a certain way. If he has a business that requires some type of licensing, he needs to think about those requirements and get all that information incorporated into his documents in a way that would affect the building construction. Those designs get prepared, they get submitted to the building department for review and approval. The plans examiner, that busy guy looking over a set of plans, reviewing them, checks for code compliance, makes his recommendation to the building department. Building official determines, based on the plans examiner's recommendation, whether a certificate of plan approval can be issued, and that is the first approval and the point at which the building owner then is granted a license, with approval, granted a license to start building, so he can get his drawings out, start talking to his contractors and his builders, and he starts making this construction. He starts going through that, but he's also been tasked with the responsibility to ask for inspections by the building department at those required times where he's supposed to have the inspections done, the building inspected. So the inspector goes out, he checks off his list. When all of the required inspections are done to a satisfactory manner, that inspector reports back to the building official. The building official is in, if the building official is in concurrence, he issues a certificate of occupancy, and that is the line in the sand that says, okay, Mr. Owner, it's okay for you to safely occupy your building. Now, the owner's responsibility is not over. The little guy there in the construction hat, he does have a responsibility. The owner does have a responsibility to maintain that building in accordance with its approval, to maintain the validity of that certificate of occupancy. Time goes on, he's been using his building, he wants to make some changes, some repairs, some updates, but you know, that'll come. So the first part of this is the building approval process. It's under the regulation of the building codes. You might, as a designer, you might want to talk to the building department before you submit for the formal review, get some guidance on questions of compliance with specific provisions in the code. After occupancy is granted, the fire protection process or prevention process begins, enforced by fire officials. They too have some ability to work with the building departments in terms of reviewing construction and construction documents and providing guidance for compliance with the Ohio Fire Code down the road. Those guys up at the top, they're going to have their own process. It's going to run independently from the building department, getting to the issuing of a license so that the owner can safely operate his business, or is permitted to operate his business. The owner may want to maintain, alter, repair, add to his business, and those activities may trigger enough kind of work that he has to go back to the building department and get approval to make those alterations to his business. He may want to put an addition on, and it will send it back. Most occupancies in the commercial arena have annual inspections by fire prevention officers. They may come out, they may issue an order, and to clear that order, the owner may have to make some changes to his building, and those changes may trigger enforcement back to the building code. The building may be old enough, it may have fallen into disrepair, problems may have happened, storm damage that has created a serious hazard. It'll be a triggering event potentially. That is the kind of the one time out there where the building department goes back out to the building, makes an assessment. If it's a serious hazard or if an unsafe condition, the building official may issue an order that may also trigger the building code, and the owner has to go back through the building process for those scopes of work to clear that order. Not to be forgotten, if you're a licensed operation, you may have some annual inspections, and that licensing agency may, to renew your license, that building owner may need to make changes to their building. those changes may trigger the building code, and that comes back to the building department. So that's how all of these enforcement authorities kind of work together in this interlinked process. Section 105 approvals. So we've talked about how the revised code in section 379104 specifically says that an owner has to get approval for all buildings regulated under 378106, that they must comply with the rules of the board that is authorized in 378110. So that's the statutes that support enforcement of the building codes. This really creates a legal framework, and it's all about assuring public health and safety. It's about establishing minimum requirements. Again, they're minimum requirements. They can be exceeded. 3791.04 says that you can't proceed with construction without approval from that authority having jurisdiction. That approval is a license that says you can build what you have submitted, and that submission is approved. That approval says that if built in accordance with that, it is in compliance with the rules of the board. There are established timeframes for this. So plan approval must be performed in 30 days. So the owner submits that document, the building department has 30 days to issue an approval, or if they are going to exceed that, the statute actually says that it is considered an adjudication order, and that is an adjudication order denying issuance of that license or that approval, and the owner can appeal that adjudication order. That's kind of what the statutes say. So in the Ohio Building Code, it starts with approvals are required. So if an owner intends to do any of those activities with their building, that installation that is regulated by the code, so it's within the scope of the code, he must first make application to the building department and obtain approval before he can start that construction. That's dealing with a full approval. Building, also in section 105, there's a number of different types of approvals that can happen when a full approval is not able to be granted or made, and that's the list of them. We'll touch on them briefly. So a non-conformance approval is the first one. This is when the documents do not conform to the rules of the board. The building department can still issue an approval, but there's contingency, or there's contingencies on that approval, that whatever portions are not approvable, the non-conformance items, they will not result in a serious hazard, and that the owner agrees to submit revised construction documents to clear up those non-conformance items. Now, the last caveat in all this is that if those revised construction documents are not received within 30 days at the building department, the building official shall issue an adjudication order revoking that plan approval. So it takes that approval, that non-conformance approval, away from the owner. He cannot continue his construction operation. So it's a very narrowly focused approval. And I'm not sure that it's used very often. A conditional approval, that's the next one we're going to talk about. This one too has caveats, and it's when documents cannot be approved, that an owner may request that a conditional plan approval be issued, and they can issue it if the objection is about conflicting interpretation of a piece of code or compliance. So there has to be a disagreement about what a piece of code says. And that disagreement is only dealing with minor modifications, or would only require minor modifications. It specifically goes on to say that a conditional approval cannot be issued if there's specific technical requirements that are not being met, and that any correction of the, or whatever the agreement is about the interpretation of that code piece would not cause extensive changes in the building. What a conditional approval allows is for the owner to proceed to the point where the conditions exist that are being objected to. And one of the things that has to happen for this is that those conditions that are objected to shall be put down in writing by the building official as an adjudication order, and it allows, that then allows the owner to appeal that order. And that often will be the resolution of a conflicting interpretation in a conditional approval. A key point to note, the last sentence, that a conditional approval is not a phased approval. Essentially, we'll talk about phased approval later. The real difference is that the documents can't be approved with a conditional approval because of a disagreement. A conditional approval is, or a phased approval is, where they can be approved because they do comply to a point. Previous approvals, I think, is fairly self-obvious. Phased approvals is what we'll talk about now. So this is an approval used when what has been submitted is compliant with the rules of the board, but the documents for the whole building have not been submitted yet. So perhaps some people might call it a fast track building. Some people may refer to it as we don't like to talk about it this way, but oftentimes people talk about the shell building. They can get some of it done, some of it approval. It can get started construction, and more documents will follow to finish the whole building. The risk is assumed by the owner with a phased approval, because as more is known about that building, it may impact requirements for parts of the building that have already been constructed. So the owner does need to know that in the phased approval. They should have enough information about the whole building so that they don't have worries that they can't get approval for the entire structure at the end of their process. Here again, a phased approval can only proceed to the point in which the approval has been given. So if they have a foundation approval, if they have a foundation and structural support approval, if they have through a roof approval, they can only go that far, and they can't do any more. They still have to be able to get all of those systems that go in a building inspected and approved as they go. An annual approval is an interesting one. This one is for alterations to building systems primarily, building service systems, building service equipment. It can be issued by the building official, and it's basically an annual approval, and it's issued to a company or corporation that has a person employed at the company who holds a certificate from the Board of Building Standards for the type of work that they are doing work on. And essentially, they can move forward under the annual approval and make those changes because that certified employee of the company is making sure that that work is done in conformance with the rules of the board. Now, there's a caveat to all this with the annual inspections, is that they must also maintain some pretty specific records. They have annual approval records, which is detailed records of any alterations that are made. Access to those records must be available to the building department at all times, and we would say reasonable times. And they must have the applicable construction documents. So basically, they can document the whole thing. So validities of approvals. Approvals have validity that basically, in the absence of fraud or serious hazard, any structure that's built in accordance with the approved plans is conclusively presumed to comply with the statutes and the rules of the board, the building codes. There are expirations and extensions for those approvals, and they are different. An approval can expire. It becomes invalid if work is not commenced within 12 months of the approval. So the owner gets the license to start construction. If he doesn't start in 12 months, that approval is invalid. He has to start the process over. He can do one extension of that approval if he notifies the building department before it expires that he needs an extension. Extension. So once the work starts, if for some reason the work is delayed or suspended for more than 6 months, the approval becomes invalid. The owner has, again, here the ability to extend that, and this time he has 2 opportunities. So he can get a 6-month extension 2 times if he requests that extension before the approval has been invalidated. Certificates of plan approvals. So you get you go through the plan approval process, and you get the building official has to issue a certificate of plan approval to the owner so that he can start his construction. There's specific content that must be on that certificate of plan approval. That's the list. This is an example of a certificate of plan approval. It can be found on the Board of Building Standards website under the Building Department resource packet. Your jurisdiction may have their own. You may use something similar to this, but something along this line has to be issued.
Jay, you have 3 minutes.
Yes.
3 minutes.
This one is certificate of occupancy, which is the other approval. So I mentioned that you have to get 2 approvals from the building department. One is a plan approval to start construction. One is a certificate of occupancy to occupy the building. Construction documents. This is the meat in the sandwich between 105 approvals and 107, the approval process, plan approval. This is what the owner has to submit to the building department. It is has a list under 106.1.1, which has all of these different types of information that need to be in the construction documents so that the plan review can make adequate assessment of whether it's compliant with the rules of the board. Fire protection systems can be a conditional approval, and if your building requires special inspections, that's Chapter 17 out of the OVC, that list must be provided by the owner or the designer to in the plan examination. There are also listed several provisions where these types of building projects have additional or other authorities having jurisdiction. So industrialized units needs board approval through the IU program. Public swimming pools go to the Ohio Department of Health. Consumer fireworks, State Fire Marshal's Office. Flood hazard areas get some FEMA involvement and floodplain administration. Fire protection systems may have some involvement from the fire officials in that jurisdiction. Jails and prisons, Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections. Hazardous materials have potentially 2 paths. One is associated if the hazardous material is associated with building services, and those where the hazardous material is not associated with building services. Evidence of responsibility must be on the documents. Who is primarily responsible? The seal of a registered design professional is basically regulated by their registration laws, but we do require evidence of responsibility. A seal is not required for this list of item or types of buildings. If a drawing is amended or construction documents are amended after they are first approved, and they would be substantial changes, they must be resubmitted to the building official for approval prior to executing that work. Alternative materials and methods. So if there are some prescriptive things in the sections of the Ohio Building Code. If you are going outside of the prescriptive side of things, section 114 is going to be important. Rob's going to talk about much more about that later. So if it's prescribed in the code, 114.3.1, if it is not prescribed, section 114.3.2 talks about how, what kind of documentation, what kind of information needs to be present for plan approval of those materials, methods of construction. Alternative engineered design is another one, and there's 106.5.1 through 5.3, talks about design criteria, submittal information, technical data. So if you're using alternative engineered design, you have to make a statement of conformity with the intent. You have to provide equal or greater performance and in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. The submittal has to indicate that it is using alternative engineered design. It also needs to be incorporated on the approval and permanent record that 106.5 was used. There needs to be sufficient substantial technical data must be submitted by the registered design professional, and their seal laws will probably generate a seal on this.
Well, obviously, there's a lot to cover in Chapter 1, and we need to cut it short at this point. You have 15 minutes to your next class, Chapter 1, Part 2. Thank you very much, Jay, for all of the informative discussion. There are a lot of published questions in the live event Q&A, which we will do our best to go ahead and answer. And we thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you. My apologies.